Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
How is Canada doing at securing the border? It's been Donald Trump's top demand. He wants to see Canada crack down on drugs and illegal immigration or face retribution from the White House. It has been a month now since the federal government appointed a fentanyl czar on top of $1.3 billion in spending on border security. How does the plan stack up against the size and the scope of the problem? Are we doing enough to address Trump's demands? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, I'm speaking with Christian Leuprecht, Distinguished Professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, an expert on Canadian border security. Hi, Christian. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, my pleasure.
So I'd like to ask you first about the extent of Canada's border problem, such as it is. Do we do a good job generally with border security? Is it a total disaster? Is it adequate, room for improvement? How would you describe the nature of the issue here?
Look, we have a very good professional cross-border relationship with the Americans, and we've had it for decades. We've especially worked aggressively on it in a constructive way since the late 1990s. We really accelerated that after 2001 with the Smart Border Accord in December 2001 after the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York on September 11th, 2001. Then the Harper government negotiated the Beyond the Border Accord that really deepened that cooperation. There was more deepened cooperation with the renegotiation of NAFTA in 2017. The challenge on the Canadian side has always been resources. That there's simply relatively little money and relatively few people. That has a couple of reasons. One is that, especially for the current government, it has not been a priority. The uniformed organizations, the RCMP, CDSA, and the Canadian Forces are all short-staffed for a government that has grown the civil service by 45%. So you can see that it's clearly just not been a priority. But there's also the challenge of, in a country like Canada, you're always sort of competing for resources. And I think there's not been a adaptation in Canada to the fact that the world has changed, that U.S. expectations have changed. And so we still, I think, very much live sort of in perhaps sort of a holiday in terms of the way we think that the world should be instead of the way the world is. And I think that's resulted in a situation where we just simply didn't pay attention. And the world changed. And as a result, Canada effectively undermined the agreement it's had with the United States since 1938 that we would have one another's back. And certainly the perception is by the Trump administration and previously, but before it, by the Biden administration, that Canada has not lived up to its promise to make sure it has America's back.
Okay, that being said, when you hear the president talking about the scourge of drugs, migrants flowing into the U.S., he often lumps Canada and Mexico in together. How fair is it to do that, given that we know far more drugs and migrants in terms of total quantity flow from Mexico into the U.S. rather than from Canada?
Yeah, there's a bit of the of historical construction rhetoric there, for sure. Going back to the late 19th century, there's sort of a narrative in the U.S. that all bad things come from outside the U.S. And if the U.S. could only sort of close its borders, then that would keep sort of U.S. society sort of pure from all these bad influences. So there is a little bit of that going on. But the challenge from Canada has been a long time coming. Look, for instance, the government made some terribly ill-informed choices. In 2016, it dropped the visa requirement on Mexican nationals against the explicit advice of its own civil service. And what did we get? We got tens of thousands of people from Mexico who either claimed refugee status, who flew to Canada with forged travel documents for the explicit purpose either to claim refugee status in this country or to make their way across the border to the United States. And that's where the Americans said, look, this is not. We had an accelerated problem from India when when the government decided to expedite visa approvals on a big backlog of visas, as a result of which, without putting the resources into proper security screening, and as a result of that, we got a huge influx of people from India, either coming to this country and claiming refugee status, or coming to this country for the explicit purpose of making their way to the United States. And that's where the Americans say, this doesn't look like a country that has our back and that has our best interests at heart.
So back in December, in response to these concerns being raised by the Trump administration, the federal government did announce a new border security plan, $1.3 billion in funding. They added on to that the appointment of what they call a fentanyl czar, a position to coordinate enforcement on fentanyl crossing the border specifically. What's your impression of that border package? Do you think it's sufficient in terms of a response to the issues that have been raised by the Americans?
So it's not really a plan. It's an announcement, right? So it's $1.3 billion over 6 years by government that then subsequently had the prime minister effectively resign, and we have a caretaker government without the mandate, without the electoral mandate from Canadians, and prorogue parliament, which means it couldn't actually pass a supply bill. So So the Trump administration says it's nice that you have sort of this alleged plan, but you haven't actually been able to take the measures necessary that would actually make good on this plan. All you have is current fiscal year money that is effectively being reallocated and redistributed by government that, of course, imposed cuts on all these agencies in April of this year, knowing full well that the Trump administration could ostensibly win. Yes, there are announcements of fentanyl czar. The fentanyl czar does not come with more money. He doesn't come with any people, and he doesn't come with any legislative change. So we've announced a couple of helicopters. I'm not sure our helicopters are going to help us interdict fentanyl, and I'm not sure our helicopters are going to. We don't need fellow helicopters to identify the irregular migrants to the United States, because the problem is we know where they're crossing. We just don't have any resources to respond when people are crossing. And so this is, I think, part of the sort of frustration by the U.S. government, that we have these things that sound really good, but the question is, once you start to scratch the surface, A, is there actually anything behind that? And B, what's the actual strategy? Are we actually going to connect the dots and see that we've had a proliferation of human smuggling through this country? Yes, on the decline, but as a result of political decisions that this government made, we've had a substantial growth in the production of fentanyl for the domestic market, with some spillover effects to the United States. Again, sin of omission, because the government wasn't paying attention and was too busy doing other things. We've had a proliferation of financial crime. Look at the Crown Commission on Money Laundering in British Columbia. Look at the criminal indictment, guilty plea by TD Bank in the United States. You can hear the frustration in the Biden administration's Attorney General's voice when he announces that, clearly expecting that Canada should be enforcing against its own banks. It shouldn't be the United States having to do that. We've had a growth in organized crime organizations in this country, 2,000 of them now, and the growth just in a couple of years of from 54 to 99, the number that are involved in the production and distribution of fentanyl. We've had a proliferation of Mexican cartels. We've had Asian organized crime groups that have set up their North American headquarters in Canada because they know it is so unlikely that they're going to be detected, disrupted, let alone prosecuted. And so the U.S. administration is going, where's the plan to actually contain this proliferation of liabilities to the United States?
And nothing about what the federal government did announce is ticking those boxes? You don't think the Americans think very much of what the government has done?
No, I think, look, the Americans appreciate what the government is doing, but the Americans also realize that, look, when the prime minister could have got himself a strong electoral mandate, the prime minister could have kept parliament in place. He deliberately did neither of those two things. Why? Because any aggressive plan that the government could have announced would have been a serious liability with core electoral constituencies for the current government. So what did the government decide to do? Well, let's minimize our margin for maneuver, essentially by having this caretaker government and proroguing parliament, because then we can go to the Trump administration. We can say, look, here's all the stuff. There's only a few things we can do currently, and then we promise we'll do more once we have a government again and once we have a parliament. So essentially hoping that by buying themselves some runway, somehow this problem sort of will go away. So just like the government made political decisions when it came to immigration, when it came to organized crime, when it came to financial crime in this country, the government made a political decision not to get itself an electoral mandate, and it made a political decision to prorogue parliament.
Okay. Okay, very interesting. So back to fentanyl specifically, because this is one of the two things that have been named as an irritant for the United States. How much is fentanyl a border control problem compared to a law enforcement problem domestically? And what I mean by that is there a lot of fentanyl being produced in Canada and sold to the United States? Or is it more a function of chemicals that come into Canada, which then enter the drug trade and can be used to manufacture fentanyl in the United States? Can you give us some perspective on where does the fentanyl come from? How often is it crossing the border? How will beefing up the border do much to crack down on fentanyl specifically?
So we have an overproduction problem in this country because it's been so easy to bring precursor chemicals into this country, and because the risk of enforcement is basically minimal. Look, the super lab that the RCMP busted in Falkland, BC on October 31st, all of one person got charged in that regard. So it shows you that we have great difficulty actually charging people. What we do is every now and then we have a little bus that takes a few of these chemicals out of circulation. So the chemicals come in through the International Mail Center in Vancouver in little packages, and they come in through the Port of Vancouver. The City of Delta has an open source report that listeners can read for themselves about the challenges with the Port of Vancouver and the spillover effects in organized crime that is generating in places such as Delta. And so as a result, because of the ease with which you can operate in this country and you can launder money, we have an overproduction problem in this country. And so what goes to the United States is more of a spillover effect. That is to say, we have too much here. And so some groups decide to move some of it to the United States. The bulk of that overproduction actually goes elsewhere. It goes to Australia, it goes to Asia, because it fetches much more money there. Yes, we do have a spillover problem, but it would be very difficult to detect fentanyl crossing the border to begin with. Both because we would have to invest in enforcement and because it's so challenging in small quantities to detect as it crosses the border. But really, the better thing that we could do is actually go after these supply pipelines and go after the production infrastructure that is by and large run by a couple of Mexican cartels in Canada that are essentially running the production and the wholesale distribution chain. But we're simply not set up, for instance, in terms of the RCMP to do that. We have a federal police force that spends 85% of its time, money, and resources doing contract policing for provinces, territories, indigenous communities, and local communities. And then with the rest, where it is short-staffed, is left with 4 key federal policing mandates, none of which it can adequately meet. Again, the government has had a decade to reform the RCMP and has chosen not to do that.
The idea of creating a new federal agency for fentanyl specifically has been floated. What do you think about that idea? Stand up a whole new enforcement agency just to deal with fentanyl specifically?
Well, that's a guarantee that we're not going to get anything done for 5 years.
Okay.
Anytime you stand up a new bureaucracy, that's a guaranteed way to kick the can further down the road. If you want to get things done in public administration, you work with the structures that you have. That's why the fentanyl czar is actually not a bad idea, because it means there's actually, if provided Kevin Brosseau has the necessary authorities, then he will actually be able to connect the dots, get people to work together across departments, set priorities, and especially for the Americans, one common criticism is in Canada, there's half a dozen departments that hold this file. Who do we call? Well, nobody ever seems to be in charge. Well, at least now we can show there is someone in charge and there is a person you can call when you want to deal with someone on a specific issue.
Here's a question that I hear a lot that I think hasn't been adequately answered for the general public. We know what the chemical precursors are that are needed to make fentanyl. They're legal chemicals. They're readily available for purchase from international suppliers. Why can't the government simply say those chemicals are illegal to import and make it illegal to purchase them? Would that not dry up the supply?
So it's true. So some of these chemicals are brought into the country legally and then repurposed for illicit purposes. But many of them are never legally brought into the country to begin with. So simply scheduling these chemicals won't make a huge difference, but it will increase compliance for some of the drugs and other legal manufacturing that uses those chemicals. It's a challenge. But look, for instance, the federal government got out of port policing years ago, and so if we don't have an effective port police, well, what do you think the criminals are going to do? They're going to exploit that weakness. If we don't have significant resources to enforce at the Vancouver International Mail Center in Vancouver, well, guess what? The transnational organized criminals will exploit that weakness. They are very good at finding weaknesses and capitalizing on them.
So as of right now, at the mail center, at the Port of Montreal, at the Port of Vancouver, what is the current border enforcement oriented towards, and how would it need to be reoriented to make significant gains on addressing fentanyl precursors coming into the country?
Yeah, I'd probably try to figure out what's the end game that we're trying to go after. And I think the end game will never be able to be that we're going to eliminate these scourges altogether. The end game has to be to try to deter transnational organized crime from setting up shop in Canada, because it's easier to set up shop elsewhere. I think, and there are clearly many pieces to this where much of this sort of goes back to the late 1990s and the Pacific Rim strategy, when Canada opened up its financial markets, its capital, its trade with the Indo-Pacific region. But we never put in place either the financial crime capabilities, generally the more robust financial sort of frameworks that would be necessary, or the organized crime enforcement. And so what we got was all the financial crime, and it was all the organized crime that came along with open up to the Indo-Pacific Rim. And so now, as it turns out, not just is it difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, it's especially difficult when for a decade you haven't paid attention to these developments, put your head in the sand and pretended these things aren't happening and they're someone else's problem. And now there's a president in the US going, you need to do something yesterday. And we're going, well, it's really difficult to do all these things on very short notice. Can you give us some time? And he's saying, no, I can't give you any time. You've had plenty of time. So, I would say a lot of this is self-inflicted pain.
You wrote an op-ed back in December, I think it was, and you were very critical of Canada's ability to enforce financial crimes. Can you describe how money laundering, how financial crime fits into the equation of the drug trade in Canada? I understand that it's easier for a criminal enterprise to set up their financial shop in Canada than in the US. Can you take us through how that fits into the puzzle?
So organized crime basically runs two lines of business. One is the illicit wares that they peddle, the drugs, the guns, the human smuggling, whatnot. The other is laundering those proceeds. And the piece that they really protect is the second one, because they can always find other ways to make money. In Canada, as the Crown Commission on Money Laundering in British Columbia reported in 1,800 pages, it is particularly easy to engage in financial crime and to launder your money. To give you an idea, so the estimates are by the Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada that between $45 billion and $113 billion gets laundered through Canada annually. To give you an idea, so the current structural deficit in Canada is $46 billion. and 113 billion is about the direct federal government spending. So these are huge amounts, and they amount to between about 3 to 6% of GDP, and they're being laundered into Canada, through Canada, and within Canada. And that gives you an indication that clearly transnational organized crime believes that this is a pretty good and pretty safe way to do place to do business, and to park your money. There's an Australian criminologist that has given a term to this, the laundering through casinos and the like in Vancouver, known as the Vancouver method, and the ease with which it is to launder money into and through this country is sometimes known as snowshoring. So we've certainly developed a reputation as an easy place to do illicit business.
So we're a haven. We're a haven for the financial operations of international organized crime. Is that fair enough?
Well, I think not by design, but by consequence, right? Because we haven't really done a whole lot to curtail it. Look, for instance, I think in budget 2021, the government had announced that it was going to create the Financial Crime Agency. We're still waiting with bated breath 4 years later for the government to actually make a decision on this, for instance. We are way behind on, for instance, our parliamentary review on the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorism Financing Act. We're up for a country review that is also behind by the Financial Action Task Force this year. And that review is likely not going to be kind to Canada. These are all things the government knew were coming, but these were all just kind of things that just weren't a priority. And, I guess when you're a minority government, you have to pick your battles. And the government decided it wasn't going to pick that battle. And now it's coming back to haunt the government.
Okay, back over quickly to the other side of the equation, that is human smuggling. How does Canada do at enforcing deportation orders? So Immigration Refugee Citizenship Canada identifies somebody who no longer has a legal right to be in the country. They serve them with a deportation notice. How effective are the authorities at actually enforcing that order and ensuring these people leave the country?
So there's two dimensions to that. One is that, of course, many of these folks wouldn't be here. It's very difficult to come to Canada, right? You either have to fly here or you have to get here from the United States, both of which is difficult. So the people who end up here often end up here because of government's changes to visa requirements, as was the case for Mexican nationals and as was the case for Indian nationals with this government. So that is to say, these are homemade problems by and large. Yes, we do have a challenge with deportations. I'm not exactly sure what the numbers are now. I wrote a piece in 2019 where we had something like 40-something thousand deportation orders out, and we deported, I think, about 2,000 people that year. The challenge is that, of course, people who are up for deportation, if they're criminals, you got to find them. And of course, there's many, many avenues in this country to appeal your deportation on all sorts of grounds. There's simply not a lot of resources for inland enforcement. So CBSA is the agency that does inland enforcement. But you also have to figure a lot of places we can't deport people to. So if you're from a country that, for instance, so some countries are simply conflict countries. And so the courts have decided, or the government has decided, we're not going to deport people to those countries, even if they are up for deportation. And other countries where we could deport them simply won't issue paperwork for their people. And as a medium power, we have relatively little leverage if somebody doesn't want to issue paperwork. And you can understand, some of these countries don't necessarily want that. So we find ourselves in a situation where, it sounds like we have people out for deportation. We just find them and send them back. But it turns out that it's actually quite difficult to deport people. And that as a result, many people end up staying in Canada anyways. And we have very, very little capacity in this country to detain people. We have a couple of detention centers, but we really only detain the most egregious cases in terms of either inadmissibility or in terms of public safety risk.
Oh, okay. Last question for today. In response to the initial tariff threat from the U.S., Mexico moved 10,000 troops to their border. What do you think of the idea of using the Canadian Armed Forces to patrol Canada's borders rather than relying on the CBSA and the RCMP?
So we definitely need reform when it comes to how we enforce and patrol the border. The problem is it's not a random distribution problem. People don't come to Canada and look at a map and go, oh, I'm going to cross in Saskatchewan in the middle of February, right? People are going to cross where there's a major highway that they could reach on the other side. So this is why we have the crossings around the Peace Arch in British Columbia, where we have it around Northern Ontario, Emerson, Manitoba, Roxham Road in Quebec, and some of the areas along the St. Lawrence and the St. Clair River. So these are fairly predictable sort of flows in terms of where ultimately the people decide to cross, and much of that crossing is human smuggling, right? So it's people who are paying someone else in order to get them across. So we've essentially created an illicit industry as a second order effect by not being able to engage in proper enforcement. And again, much of this is an intelligence and is a resource problem, but it's also it's a visa problem, and these are all things that are predictable. But when you have a government that is very pro-immigration, a government that is very pro-refugees, then inherently enforcement is not very popular. And when you don't have a lot of top cover for enforcement, then agencies inherently are going to go easy, and chances are they don't have the resources to do heavy-handed enforcement to begin with.
Right. Well, it's a bleak picture that you're painting. Brass tacks, I mean, we have this number, $1.3 billion, not new spending passed by Parliament, as you outlined. It's a caretaker government. We will have an election and a new government soon enough. What kind of dollar figure can Canadians expect if the government is serious about addressing these longstanding problems? Billions of dollars? $10 billion?
Look, it's a great question, because that's exactly what the Trump administration is saying, right? So in terms of national security, Canada has a problem. Everything from foreign interference to organized crime to financial crime. And of course, we've been underspending on defense for decades. And so the Trump administration is saying, if you're going to have our back, it's going to be really expensive. How are you going to pay for this? You're going to build pipeline, and you're going to double down on mining and on critical minerals. Well, of course, that's an anathema to the current government, which has built a decade of its political agenda around doing the exact opposite. So you can see how the government would much prefer just to be a caretaker government and not have a parliament than to have to make difficult decisions about investing in uniformed organizations, security, intelligence, defense, that have never been a priority and interest to the government, and that would not be popular with its electoral constituency, nor to make the decisions about where the money for that sort of investment would come from by doing things that this government has long refused to, has long believed that this is not, we all know where the government stands on pipelines and where the government stands on mining. So we make political trade-offs. And these trade-offs, on the one hand, have impoverished Canada. On a per capita GDP basis, Canadians are worse off today than they were a decade ago. And if we look at both public safety, national security, and border security, I would contend that Canadians are less safe today than a decade ago. These are political choices that we make. And these choices are directly related to how we allocate the scarce resources that we have.
Okay. Christian Leuprecht, thank you so much for the time today. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I hope our listeners have as well. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, David.
And again, that is Christian Leuprecht. He is a distinguished professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, an expert in Canadian border security and international organized crime. And that is the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. We love hearing from you. You can find us on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast players, please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.